We heard you like turrets, so we put turrets on your turrets, were presumably the words that echoed around the Detroit tank arsenal when the M3 Lee was first unveiled in 1941. Its design was certainly unorthodox, featuring not only the aforementioned stacked turret arrangement, but also a giant main cannon embedded in its hull. But was it any good? This question has been divisive for generations now. On one side are the Lee haters, who argue that it was a cobbled together mess of a tank that was of little use on the battlefield, and on the other side we have the Lee enjoyers, who believed that while it was certainly flawed, it was a perfectly adequate tank that appeared at a crucial point in the war. Today, we're going to dive headfirst into this debate, getting to the bottom of the matter once and for all and figuring out the reality of this highly divisive tank. To begin, let's keep it chronological and look at the development of the Lee, because without knowing how and why it was designed, we're in no position to come to an informed verdict. At the outset of World War II, American tanks were severely lacking. The nation's tank history began during World War I, when the fledgling US Army Tank Corps were established in 1917. They initially utilized French and British tanks, as they lacked any of their own. The solution to this problem was found with the M1917 light tank, an American-manufactured copy of the French Renault FT. However, it entered production too late to see service during the war, and in many ways American enthusiasm for tanks seemed to have died alongside their immediate need for them, as throughout the interwar years, funding for new projects was always pretty minimal, and as a result, progress was always slow. So, this left the US in a bit of a sticky situation when World War II broke out, as all they would have to take to the front when the war came to their door were woefully antiquated designs such as the M1 combat car and the M2 light tank. Worse still, as time went on, developments in Europe made it apparent that tanks would not play just a supporting role, but an essential role in this new war, making the US's poor tank situation into less of a potential inconvenience and more of a potentially unmitigated disaster. Naturally, therefore, an absolutely huge amount of cash was assigned to tank development, and tank development began. They needed modern tanks, and they needed them now. This rush to develop a modern tank resulted in a myriad of proposals and experiments, all the while the US keenly observed the successes and failures of European tanks on the battlefield to garner useful insights. In particular, the British Matilda and French Char B1 tanks showed promise, and the US designers took note of these, seeking to incorporate their successful features such as heavy armor, powerful guns, and effective suspension systems into their own design, all while maintaining ease of production so that the US could better play catch-up. The Lee emerged from this process as a technologically basic design that could be pushed to production as quickly as possible so that its bigger brother, the advanced M4 Sherman, the tank the US really wanted, could have the time spent on it to be developed properly and thoroughly. It featured a 75mm main gun mounted in a casement on the right side of the hull, a 37mm cannon in a rotating turret on top, and a 30-06 machine gun mounted in another turret on top of the 37mm turret. Now, this unusual arrangement was the result of the Lee's need to be produced quickly. The US already had 37mm turrets figured out, but 75mm turrets had thus far proved elusive, so to save time, they just smashed together whatever they had, and voila! The Lee was born! So, now that we know the design of the Lee, the circumstances that led to it, we have a decent foundation upon which we can start making our informed analysis. But before we can do that, we need to know how well it performs in combat. So let's bring this chapter of the video to a close and look at exactly that. The Lee made its first foray into battle in spring 1942 in the arid climes of the North African desert and under the banner of the British 8th Army. It was a most welcome addition to the British arsenal following continual losses of their indigenous tanks throughout the campaign. It also signalled a reversal of fortunes for the British, largely due to its potent 75mm cannon and the significant upgrade over the 57mm mainstay of the British up until that point. It proved effective against both tanks and fixed guns, the latter being easily dealt with by its potent high-explosive rounds and the latter by an advanced armor-piercing rounds. But certainly not without its issues. The casement-mounted main gun configuration offered limited traverse, which proved particularly perilous against an opponent famous for favoring highly mobile warfare that was operating in an environment that gave them a nearly endless expanse of land to conduct it in. The tank's towering silhouette also proved to be a bit of a double-edged sword. Sometimes it was great, offering a strategic vantage point on the flat desert terrain, allowing the gunners to squeeze a few more precious meters of range out of the high-mounted 37mm cannon during distant engagements. But on the flip side, it also made it a pretty easy target for the enemy. Furthermore, the low position of the 75mm gun also reduced the ability of the Lee to dig in for extra cover, which proved particularly dangerous during defensive engagements. Despite these issues, however, the British forces seem to have held the Lee in very high regard overall, largely due to its reliability in comparison to the Crusader tank, which was notorious for its engine reliability problems in the desert. By March 1942, the British had around 340 Lees in North Africa, and with no immediate replacement on the horizon, they set about making field modifications to improve it further still, including the installation of sand shields, improved exterior stowage, and changes to internal ammunition stowage, among others. As for its performance in specific engagements, the Battle of Gazala serves as a useful case study. This may seem like an odd choice at first because the 1942 battle was a defeat for the Allied forces, but delve a little bit deeper, and what we see, in fact, was that the Lee was one of the few things that didn't disappoint in that battle, and its contributions were one of the few things that stopped the defeat becoming a complete disaster. In particular, it proved exceptionally robust against enemy fire, with one German officer noting that a Lee from the 22nd Armoured Brigade had sustained 31 hits before finally being knocked out. The British Lees would get a chance to prove their mettle once again in the Battle of Alam Halfa in August 1942, during which it made up 18% of all British tanks committed to the battle. Despite facing newly upgraded Panzer IVs, a very fearsome prospect indeed, the Lees once again showcased their robustness, happily taking a kicking and returning the favour well enough to help drive the British to victory. Losses at the Alam Halfa total 31 of the 67 Lees deployed, with 13 being repairable and 18 being total losses. Now, this might sound bad, but when they averaged a kill-to-loss ratio of 2-to-1 during the battle, I would say this is a pretty solid win for the Lee. Overall then, it appears that while the Lee was no wonder tank, it was certainly a useful asset for the British during the North Africa campaign, providing a potent anti-tank capability and withstanding substantial punishment when needed, despite its very real flaws. But the Lee was only a stopgap measure after all. And as 1942 turned into 1943, the Lee would gradually be phased out in favour of the M4 Sherman by the British. So, in pursuit of more evidence that we can use to assess its quality, let's now look at how well it served when flying under the banner of its creators, the Americans. So contrary to the British, who appear to have largely embraced the Lee despite its flaws, the Americans were initially much more polarized on the matter. Sure, it represented a huge step up from their earlier M3 light tanks, but its unconventional design appears to have been a bit of a bugbear for many American leaders. Major General Jacob Devers, commander of the Army Ground Forces in particular, was fiercely critical, believing the tank with its mighty gun shackled in an inflexible casement to be the equivalent of a eunuch. It had all the necessary equipment needed, but it was functionally useless. But was his assessment actually correct? To answer that, we need to look at the Lee's first combat with the Americans, which came in November of 1942 when they engaged the Germans in Tunisia. The attack was unsuccessful, but as with the British at Gazala, it seems doubtful that the Lee can be blamed for the poor result here, with it being less of a testament to the Lee's deficiencies and more of a reflection of flawed American strategies. Newly minted crews were thrown into complex battlefield scenarios without the necessary familiarity with the Lee's operational capacities or tactical knowledge in order to maximize its effectiveness, and, well, as a result, the Lees were often outmaneuvered into disadvantageous positions, leaving them vulnerable to German anti-tank weaponry. Furthermore, they found themselves chronically outgunned by the German tanks, largely due to poor ammunition and a lack of supporting infantry and artillery. Now, this poor performance persisted all throughout December, with the 1st Armoured Division suffering heavy losses at Taborba on the 6th of December, and by the month's end, 40 Lees had been completely destroyed. Now, all of this naturally sparks a question. How could its performance have been decent with the British, but so bad with the Americans, particularly in regards to its ammunition? Well, put simply, this was because they didn't use the same ammunition. The British used their own indigenous rounds, an advanced capped armor-piercing ballistic round that utilized a high-explosive filler to not only penetrate the enemy tank, but make a mess of its insides when it did. The Americans, by comparison, used a conventional solid-shot armor-piercing round, which was great for penetrating armor. It just didn't do much damage once it had broken through the armor. Then to note further, there were also slight differences between the British and American Lees, but as this video is focused on assessing the merits of the tank rather than providing a dry and comprehensive technical overview, we're not going to concern ourselves with most of them, as they frankly just aren't that pertinent or interesting. You're welcome. Unfortunately for the Americans, their ammunition problem was never fully resolved during the operational lifetime of the Lee, and this left them as lackluster underperformers. So, where does this leave our ongoing assessment? On one hand, we have seen how in British use it was perfectly decent, if not outright good, but on the other hand, we saw it as pretty disappointing with the American service. So this juxtaposition leaves us somewhat at odds, and what we need to get to the bottom of this is for the Lee to have served with a different military, ideally one completely removed from the Western Allies and with their own way of doing things, and fortunately for us, it did. So now, let's bring our combat analysis to a close by looking at its service with the Soviets. The Lee made its combat debut with the Soviets in May 1942, serving with the 114th Tank Brigade. In total, 957 Lees would be delivered to the Soviets by the end of shipments in mid-1943, a number sufficient for it to serve across multiple fronts and give us a wide sample of data from which we can further assess its merits. Initially, things aren't looking good for the Lee here, because post-war sources are rife with condemnation of the Lee, decrying it as a grave for severed brothers on account of its supposed fragility. However, it is essential to consider the context and potential biases of these post-war sources when interpreting their portrayal of the Lee. Many of these narratives were penned during the Cold War era, a period fraught with political tension and marked by an urge to elevate one's own national contributions while diminishing those of opponents. As a result, there was an inclination to overstate the effectiveness of Soviet efforts on the Eastern Fronts, which were indeed significant, but while not the whole story. It was in this atmosphere that the Lee, a primary component of the Lend-Lease aid from the US, often found itself harshly criticized. By casting the Lee in a poor light, these authors could undermine the significance of Lend-Lease and present the war as more of a wholly Soviet victory than it actually was. This clearly is a perspective that we need to be critical of. So, if we look through all of the Cold War propaganda, how did it actually perform with the Soviets? Fortunately, plenty of accounts have emerged since the collapse of the Soviet Union that allow us to accurately answer this question, with one of particular interest coming from an engagement that took place in Smolensk in late 1942. According to this report, a contingent of Lees from the Red Army's 20th Armored Division found themselves against an advancing detachment of German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. Outnumbered and seemingly outgunned, the Lees took up defensive positions within a dense grove of trees, exploiting their high profile to obtain a superior firing position over the gently sloping terrain. As the German tanks advanced, the Lees opened fire, their powerful 75mm main gun delivering accurate and devastating shots. The Lees were able to punch through the German armor perfectly effectively. The Germans, surprised and outmaneuvered, were forced to pull back, leaving several smoldering panzer wrecks on the battlefield. The Lees, despite taking several direct hits, showed remarkable resilience and only suffered 2 tanks knocked out during the engagement. This happily supports the conclusion that we've so far been slowly ratcheting towards, that the Lee was a perfectly acceptable tank when it was used correctly. But is this perspective truly conclusive? Fortunately, having now reviewed the design, the development, and the deployment of the Lee, we're finally able to review everything that we've learned today and start arriving at some real answers, so let's bring it all to a close and do exactly that, shall we? So, before we can say whether or not the Lee was a good tank, we must first refine our argument and ask ourselves the questions: what even is a good tank anyway? What are our metrics for judging whether a tank is good or bad? And, well, to what extent does the context of its creation allow greater forgiveness for its flaws? Firstly, the definition of a good tank is not clear-cut. In its purest form, a tank is a blend of armor, firepower, and mobility. A good tank, then, might be seen as one that optimally balances these 3 elements, providing effective protection for its crew while maintaining an ability to traverse diverse terrains and deliver destructive force upon an enemy. It should also demonstrate a degree of reliability and ease of maintenance, enabling it to perform consistently in varying battlefield conditions. By this definition, the Lee shows a respectable, though not exemplary, balance of these factors. It did have its flaws, such as its tall profile and the awkward positioning of its main gun, but it was also robust, it was well armed, and it was pretty mobile for its time. In regard to the second question, we must consider its operational performance, its actual impact on the battlefield beyond the aforementioned technical factors. Here, the Lee's record is mixed, but overall, it served its purpose adequately when used correctly. And many of its most glaring flaws, namely some of its ammunition and some of its crews, cannot be attributed to fundamental flaws in design, but on the flip side, some of its more minor flaws, such as its high profile and inflexible main gun, are intrinsic to its design. But are these various flaws enough to condemn the tank? And we think not. Lastly, the context of its creation undoubtedly affects our assessment. The Lee was conceived and produced under considerable urgency as a stopgap measure to plug a hole in the Allies' armored capabilities until the superior Sherman could be mass-produced. The very fact that it was operational and reasonably effective in such a short time frame is exactly why it was a good tank. It was designed to stem the tide and prevent disaster, not to be perfect. And it did that really well. So to bring us back to the question that we posed right at the start of today's video, yeah, we think the Lee was a perfectly good tank all in all. It might not inspire the raw awe of some of its more famous siblings, and it certainly was by no means the best, but it was fine. It was fine.